Now, let me explain the 19th century Korea and East Asia and the trends of those countries. Korea is locating here, and China used to be the traditional hegemon of East Asia, and China enjoyed the traditional influence over the Korean peninsula for the past 100 years, hundreds of years. And Japan at the time, 19th century, was an emerging power. Japan, until the mid 19th century, was a periphery in Asia because Asian civilization rose China and it transferred to Korea geographically, and that civilization transferred to Japan. So it remained as a periphery until the mid 19th century, but its all early opening to the Western powers provided a great success. So Japan was the emerging power in East Asia in the mid and late 19th century. And at the time, the US did not have any interests over Asia, but it's gradually increased its interest in Asia largely because of the Philippines. Because the US, after winning the US-Spanish War, the US got the Philippines. So Asia, the US interest over Asia gradually increased over here. And Russia traditionally had interests of the unfrozen ports. Even in Vladivostok here, the sea in front of Vladivostok gets frozen in wintertime. So for Russia, the eastern coast of Korea was a potential for a great ports for Russia. So it has the traditional interest over the unfrozen ports in East Asia. In the year 1854 was a very important year for Asian history. In the 1854, American Admiral Matthew Perry led a naval expedition to Japan in front of the Tokyo Bay and asked for trade and openness. And Japanese king surrendered right away. So Perry signed a treaty and opened up trade relations with Japan. So Japan opened to the Western countries in the year 1954. For about 10 years ago, 10 years before the opening of Japan, China was engaged in the war with the UK, the so-called the First and Second, the Opium War. Obviously, China lost the Opium War vis-a-vis the Great Britain. The Chinese defeat in the Opium War was a great shock for many Asian countries because the largest and strongest power in Asia got defeated by a small power in Europe, the UK, the Great Britain. So it was a great shock for Asia. And several years later, French Admiral Rose invaded Ganghwa-do for the revenge of the killing of 9 French missionaries by the regent. Regent means the father of king. And let me introduce a brief history of Joseon dynasty at that time. This is a picture of King Gojong at the time. When he was throned, he was 7 years old. So he couldn't do anything, so his father, regent, grabbed the remote control behind him. So he controlled the Joseon politics. And obviously, regent was pro-China. So he heavily defended all of his policies, foreign policies and domestic policies on China, the Qing dynasty. But the Chinese defeat in the Opium War was a great, great shock for the regent. So he pursued the closed door policy. With the closed door policy, he was not going to open Joseon dynasty to any other countries. He just cut all the relationship with the other countries, including the US and France and the UK. Also at the same time, he killed already hundreds of the Christians in Joseon dynasty, including 9 French missionaries. That's why French Admiral Rose invaded Ganghwa-do and burned all the palaces and the historical documents in Ganghwa-do. This is a picture of the regent, father of King Gojong. Obviously, he was pro-China, and in later years of his life, he became competing with his daughter-in-law, the Queen Myeongseong, later, who was pro-Japan first time, later pro the US. And with a power rivalry between the regent and his daughter-in-law, Myeongseong, he got defeated later. After the opening by Perry, Japan went to turmoil of social revolution, the so-called Meiji Revolution or Meiji Restoration. It was a chain of events that led to enormous changes in Japanese political, social structure. So Japan jettisoned all the traditional things. Japan made all the Japanese men cut their hair short like Western people and dropped the Japanese traditional suits and started to wear the Western uniform and started to have the modern army system. So after the Meiji Restoration, Japan started Industrial Revolution, and she completed this Industrial Revolution within 30 years. So by the end of the 19th century, Japan already completed Industrial Revolution and had a dream of expanding its power to the mainland Asia. So she looked west. There's a Korean peninsula, obviously, and the mainland China. And Japan received a help signal from the Queen Myeongseong, because the Queen Myeongseong was a daughter-in-law of the regent, and Queen Myeongseong was pro-Japan in order to get rid of the Chinese influence from the Joseon dynasty. And Queen Myeongseong was the leader of the anti-Chinese group in Joseon. So after the fall of regent in 1873, from the competition with his daughter-in-law, the queen, and Japan made a Ganghwa-do treaty with Joseon dynasty. Japan started a major offense to Joseon and defeated Joseon Navy. So Ganghwa-do treaty was an unequal treaty with Japan, and it was the first treaty for trade and openness, and also the end of Joseon dynasty's closed-door policies. Closed-door policy. Since then, Joseon opened the door to the Western countries. Now, Japan made Joseon dynasty open for trade with Japan and other countries, but still, China remained a strong obstacle in Japanese influencing the increasing influence over the Korean Peninsula. So it was inevitable to have a war with China. And surprisingly, in the Sino-Japanese War between 1894 and 1995, the people call it the First China-Japanese War. And Japan won. Japan defeated the Qing dynasty. So the so-called paper tiger, Chinese empire, turned out to be a paper tiger. And finally, Shimonoseki Treaty was signed in April 1895. So Japan successfully got rid of the Chinese power from the Joseon dynasty. But Queen Myeongseong was still powerful and also turned her position from pro-Japan to anti-Japan. She asked for help from the US. So Queen was the final obstacle for the Japanese. So Japan tried to get rid of the Queen. So 1895, right after the war, Japanese minister hired about 30 samurais and killed the Queen in the palace. Right after the Queen's assassination, the King Kojong sent a help signal to the United States, but there was no signal from the United States. The King Kojong immediately escaped to the Russian embassy. So he went into the Russian embassy and worked there for about 6 months. And guess what? Russian influence over the Joseon politics started. So Russia became the major power which exercised the influence over Joseon politics. This is a portrait of Queen Myeongseong. She became the queen of Joseon dynasty when her age was 17, and she died when she was 43. So, again, in order to take Korea, Joseon dynasty, Japan had to have a war with Russia, the so-called Russo-Japanese War between 1904 and 5. So in the Russo-Japanese War, again, Japan defeated Russia. So Treaty of Portsmouth was signed with the mediation of the United States in September 1905. Now, Japan got rid of all the obstacles. The regent, China, and the Queen, and Russia. And during the Sino-Russo-Japanese War, this is Japan and Korea. And those days, the Russian Baltic fleet was known as invincible fleet. And it took 6 months for the Russian Baltic fleet to start from the Baltic Sea to over here. And finally, they were totally destroyed over here by the Japanese Navy. So it was the final fatal blow in the Russo-Japanese War. And after the defeat of the Baltic fleet, Russia surrendered.